Good morning. That's a really hard gospel text, which is the reason the sermon is going to be on the Old Testament reading. Our Old Testament reading from Isaiah opens like a bad superhero movie by describing a city in ruin and in need of rescue. My city is plagued by corruption, the intro comes in, where the ruthless prey on the innocent, where it isn't safe to walk by day or night. And into this city comes our God, Yahweh. I do bad things to bad people. Lord of hosts, my city, I cannot deny her. My city screams, she is mother, she is lover, and I am her God. I am vengeance. I am the night. I am Yahweh, or Batman, depending on who you're most excited about at the moment. In verses 1 through 5 of our Old Testament reading, it can seem like an over-dramatic comic book, staged for the hero to swoop in. Picture it, a city filled with ruthless marauders, needing their God to swoop in and rescue. And there is an enduring truth to the way this is written. There is a reason why kids like superheroes, why cop shows do well, why Spider-Man was one of the most successful movies right after 9/11. Because when we look around and we see a world filled with bad guys where there is corruption and the poor are taken advantage of, this can draw out of us a longing, a kind of fantasy for a hero to swoop in and make it all better. For mom to scoop us up in her arms and kiss the boo-boos away. However, the more truthful reality is that the ruthless state of the world, rather than drawing us into fantasy, quickly draws us back into righteously consigning, throwing our enemies into an outer darkness, saying that there is bad and there is good, and I am the good and they are the bad. The superheroes rarely sweep in and make the world all better for us, and it is far more likely that we just divide the world into good and to bad with enemies all around. We end up with a God made of fear, made of wrath. The words say this: you have made a city a heap, a fortified ruin. The palace of foreigners is a city no more. The cities of the ruthless nations fear you. This is our human tendency to villainize rather than to make heroes. Verses 1 through 5 of our Isaiah reading are about an economy of abundance at the expense of another. It is about the economy where the rich get richer by keeping the poor poor. God has filled our world with marvelous resources. The difficulty is distribution, getting what we have to those who need it. I can attest to you, communism is a complete failure. Capitalism has its benefits and its deep, deep drawbacks. Washington seems increasingly questionable in all the solutions it's trying to offer. Berlin, Beijing, Caracas aren't offering anything better. Global economics often magnify, dramatize, expand both the good and the bad that is happening. Both the riches and the exploitation are intensified. We live more and more into feast and famine on a global scale. When we take a look at the economics of our world, Jesus' statement about the poor will always be with us seems to be an enduring truth that we just can't shake. It all serves to build even in me, even in your clearly holy pastor who wears white every single time, a mentality of scarcity. That there just isn't enough for what we need. As a poor immigrant, I was born into and grew up in verses 1 through 5 of our Isaiah reading, a world of scarcity, drowning in debt, in neighborhoods of gangs and violence, hoping that a hero would swoop in, trying to hope that my mom would be that hero. But learning ungodly, undivine, unchristian lessons of dog eat dog, test who you will trust, expect, and plan for disappointment. I fancy myself a realist, but maybe I'm actually a pessimist. Because I live in verses 1 through 5 so often. Into this world comes the prophet Isaiah with his promise, a promise made to you and to me, a bold promise. God promises redemption to this city. The story of God doesn't end at verse 5, it keeps going. The story of God doesn't end in a city in ruins in need of hope. And that's the entire story. It keeps going. God promises his city redemption. To remove the scarcity born of injustice, God promises to set before us an abundant feast. A feast made possible by divine generosity rather than taking advantage of each other. Recently, our gospel readings have been about economics, about laborers and owners, about fair pay and generosity, about greed and injustice that keeps the poor poor. Today, we are given the promise that God will one day make his city what he's always dreamed of. God will one day bring this world's economy in line with his divine purposes. Today we are given the promise that we will one day live according to God's economy, grace-onomics, where the currency is love and the product is compassion, where you have all you need. And it's not a riches of dollars and land. The economy of God's vineyard is meant to be different, remarkably different than everything we have seen up to this point. And God's promise to restore his vineyard is a powerful one, but one easily doubted. God promises abundance born of divine generosity, and we are called on to believe this. Is it impossible in our minds? Are we willing to risk so boldly into something that seems so distant? On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all people, a sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. And the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It is a bold promise, given the condition of the world, given the condition of broken hearts. God's economy is one of abundance that is characterized as a lavish feast in our scriptures. The reason the Bible uses this imagery of feast is that because people at the time were truly hungry. Feasts weren't every other day. Eating till you were gorged at McDonald's wasn't an option for every single person. Famine was a reality. Feasts were rare because resources truly were scarce. A feast is an unimaginable luxury, happening once in a person's lifetime, most likely when they get married. Twice, maybe if you have a child that gets married. For us, God's abundance may be better described as a deeply loving community. Hunger is rarely the experience that most of us have. Starvation is almost, I don't know, have you ever known anyone to starve to death? You personally. 2,000 years ago, you would have. But in our day, it is not starvation of the body, but starvation of the heart that is all around us. A hunger that is better described as loneliness. An image of abundance that combats our modern loneliness and apathy and lack of meaningful purpose and longing for friendships. That image would be community. For us, God's promise of abundance may look more like doing what we love with those we love. Running a flower shop with your sister, building a house with your dad, gardening with your grandmother, opening a bar with your buddies, or a game shop in my case. Doing what you love with those you love. This is the image of God. This is the promise of God that feeds the hungry souls of today. It is the promise of kingdom living. And somehow in God's economy, the abundance doesn't come at the drawbacks of exploitation. You don't have to greedily take advantage of someone else to have the dream of your friends doing good things. The majority doesn't serve the decadence of a privileged few in God's economy. Rather, God's prophet Isaiah promises that all are included. Everyone gets to partake in the abundance. The Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast. The word all comes up over and over again, over all peoples, over all nations. The Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces, from all the earth. All are included in God's economy. None are excluded. God's infinite abundance is at the service of his infinite generosity, a bold promise in the city of the ruthless and the exploited. It's God's economy of abundance that comes by way of generosity. The act of giving is where we are filled up. This is where God believes the promise that seems so fantastical comes to be real. It's not in you being rich so that you have everything you've ever desired. It's you being generous, even if you have very little. That is what the feast of God looks like. Not that there is an infinite table, but that the small or large table we have is shared as far as we can stretch it. In the act of giving, we are filled up. In God's economy, the more we give away, the more we have. God starts with a few loaves and fish, begins passing it out, and ends up with 5,000 fed. Those who lose their life for the sake of God will save it. God's economy is like the act of giving love. When we give our love to another person, there is not less love in us, but more. Love is an infinite resource. And this is the generosity and the promise of God that He is trying to give to us. The city of love is the one He is trying to usher us into. Rather, through loving, we all end up with more and more and more and more. It's a remarkably different perspective on life. The more that I give, the more that I will have. As opposed to the more that I keep for myself, the more that I have. In the kingdom of God, power works in the same way. The more you give away, the more you get. When a congregation gives of its talents and treasures for the sake of our neighbors, we grow with more. Rather than hoarding power so that the things at this church are done our way, so our events can continue, so things can stay the way that we like them, when we serve another and give control to another and put everything we have given over to another rather than our own. When we ask what new ministries they need rather than asking them to help us with our old ministries, then we end up with a church perpetual, a community that fills the needs of loneliness in our LA, the city of God, as God would have it described by Isaiah. When you give and risk it all, we end up with more, is the promise of God. More people, more ministries, more money, more capacity to be the community of faith that is needed. To have it all, Jesus tells His church to give it all away. In God's economy, the more we give, the more we all have. And God's economy can only come by way of your generosity. That's how we become the hero. That's how we join our God on His team. And it's risky. But I invite you into it. May you be blessed in hearing this sermon as I've been blessed preaching it. Amen.